Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Great Decisions Masterclass. This week's foreign policy challenge is European security and the future of NATO, a classic geostrategic challenge. All the more so, given the context of the most significant hot war in Europe since the end of World War II. NATO was created in 1949. In 2024, it celebrated its 75th anniversary as the most successful defense alliance in modern world politics. In the 2024 Great Decision series, I explained the founding of NATO, its evolution over time, and the challenges that it confronts. This year, we look at it from the context of European security, which has a much longer history, dating back to the onset of modern world politics. And what we've seen is an evolution over time, trial and error by the Europeans in search of security. The world back in 1500 was dominated by a series of gunpowder empires. China, northern India, the Muscovies, and the Ottomans were all large territorial entities that dominated their populations and land masses through the application of crude military force, thus the term gunpowder empire. Europe was a completely different place, divided into more than 300 entities. Nation-states, city-states, marcher lords, and fiefdoms all coexisting in a relatively modest-sized land area. But Europe learned very quickly to turn its many weaknesses into strengths. It was divided, many countries weak, insecure, and no center of power. All this led to intense competition among them, discovery and innovation, imperialism, and nearly constant armed conflict, as Europe's stock in world affairs rose very quickly. And all of that warfare led to the need for more intense competition and discovery, a cycle driving the Europeans to the apex of the international system. If we think about the gunpowder empires, their rise and fall over long periods of time, how different that looks from the European experience, which quickly rose to dominate international affairs. The Europeans over the course of the last 500 years tried many different models of security: hegemony, balance of power, a concert system, and an international organization. All of them resulted in armed conflict. They failed. Let's begin by looking at the hegemonic model of stability. It begins with one overwhelming and dominant power, more impressive than all the other great powers combined. This is what we call a unipolar system in international relations. The other powers, large and small, fall in line beneath it. This single dominant power writes the rules of international affairs, enforces that rules on violators, and pays the price of underwriting the system. And it does this, of course, for benefit, because the hegemon applies the rules to others and then reaps benefits from the order that it created and that it manages. Some of the most peaceful eras in modern world politics have been times when a hegemon reigned supreme and the world enjoyed stability. Getting to hegemony is the problem. Let's say the green country aspires to dominate all the others. It begins by waging war on medium and small-sized powers, bringing them into their fold. It does this over and over. The more success that it has, the more alarm bells ring in the contending great powers. When the hegemon goes too far, other countries rally against it. They create a rough balance of power, and then we're looking at a hegemonic war, one that is particularly long and destructive, designed to either achieve hegemony by one or prevent it by the other major powers. Hegemonic bids have included the Habsburg Empire, Spain and Austria in 1618, Napoleonic France around 1800, and Nazi Germany in the late 1930s. Of the 6 structural or world wars since 1500, half of them have been hegemonic bids. So while hegemony may provide stability, attempts to gain hegemony oftentimes lead to massively destructive wars. Preventing a hegemonic bid requires some management of nation states, forming a natural balance so that one country does not gain an advantage over the others. If they can align in such a fashion, where power is equally distributed across, theoretically there will be no war, because you don't often go to war against an equal. If one side grows in strength, then you're going to see a rebalancing as countries switch sides for the overall goal of maintaining balance. This balance of power system is the second approach to promoting security in Europe. It fails if there is irrationality, because balance of power is premised upon the assumption that countries make calculations before going to war and only wage wars where they anticipate winning in the end. If a balance exists, a rational actor will decline to go to war. Or if there's a miscalculation, it's a very significant demand on leaders to accurately calculate their own power and the power of other countries in the system. Bandwagoning is when one country grows larger, and rather than counterbalancing, other countries join it to enjoy some of the spoils of victory. And finally, there's the rigid alliance systems problem. When countries get locked in and they cannot maneuver away from or across the balance to maintain equality on both sides, then we can see a war resulting from a balance of power system. Failed balance of power systems include the Spanish Succession War of 1703, wars of the French Revolution, which ended around 1800, and the July Crisis, which of course led directly to World War I. Just as we saw with hegemonic bids, half of structural wars since 1500 have been failures of balance of power. Not surprisingly, the Europeans scrambled for different models to prevent world wars from occurring. The Concert of Europe was created in 1815 after 4 structural wars in the previous 2 centuries. It was at the Congress of Vienna, following the Napoleonic campaigns, that the European concert system was established, a regulated balance of power approach. 5 great powers, all working together to deal with critical issues on the continent. They would meet, debate, and take votes any time a territorial change was suggested. For example, Poland in 1818. The European concert system decided by a vote of 3-2 that it would not be divided between 2 powers, each on the east and on the west. The COE, or Concert of Europe, declined over time. There were a lot of meetings early on, but within a few decades, they stopped happening. And we see with warfare on the continent a significant rise. In other words, an inverse relationship between Concert of Europe meetings, the management of the system, and outright war between the European powers. The end of the Concert of Europe happened in part because of the Anglo-German naval race around 1890 to 1905, the dual alliance between the Germans and the Austrians. The Triple Entente was formed between France, England, and Russia. They became incredibly rigid, these 2 alliance systems, and the development of the Russian rail system, which would have allowed Russia to reach the German front much more quickly, essentially creating a ticking clock for Germany to go to war if it was ever to do so. World War I, of course, resulted. The League of Nations was formed after World I as a completely different approach to managing Europe and providing security, unlike anything seen before, based in truly liberal principles as opposed to realpolitik. When the Second World War ended, and of course that indicated the massive failure of the League, 2 very different approaches were taken by the Europeans in their pursuit of security. European integration. The European coal and steel community of the late 1940s evolved into the European Economic Community. It ultimately became the European Community and ultimately the European Union. Each time integration broadened to include more countries, and it deepened into more areas of society, beyond economics, to include social issues, political coordination, and even thoughts of a united European military front. European integration is overwhelmingly liberal. It places the long-term interest of states ahead of short-term narrow interest and promotes an economic integration that reduces the likelihood of war.
It began essentially as an economic idea. The basic idea was something that was called functionalism. That is, basically, if you have economic cooperation and economic integration, that will lead functionally to other types of integration, especially political integration.
One of the great and most positive historical events of the last several centuries was the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community in the 1940s and 50s. That led to the common market, and that led to the European Union and to the European currency and to the linking of former adversaries, namely Germany and France, in constant union.
How different that is from NATO, which was established at roughly the same time that the European integration process got underway because it is premised upon realpolitik considerations. But that's okay because they each had very different targets and aims. European integration was designed to bring peace among West Europeans. The Germans, the French, the British, before that the Spanish, they were the ones involved in the major conflicts of Europe since 1500. One way to prevent them from going to war is to integrate their economic systems. Anytime countries trade with one another, the cost of war goes up significantly. NATO, on the other hand, was designed to secure Western Europe from an outside threat, the Soviet Union, expansionist militarily and ideologically. So as we think about the long road that European security has taken before the advent of NATO, so many different approaches were tried, all of them seemed to come to failure. The realpolitik approaches, like hegemony and balance of power, the managed BOP of the concert, and the overwhelmingly liberal approach of the League of Nations, 6 world wars over the course of that time. The establishment of NATO in 1949 is a bit of a different approach and an intriguing one, especially given its remarkable success. Article 5 of the NATO Charter stipulates an attack on one is an attack on all, whether that's the 12 members back in 1949 or the 30 members by the 21st century. Let's look ahead a bit at NATO, where it's headed and how it's addressing its most fundamental challenge, which is a newly resurgent Russia and a military conquest underway in Eastern Europe. The U.S. and the Soviet Union in 1945 and throughout the Cold War. We have them displayed here with European powers in between. The Russians enjoyed hegemony over their sphere of influence, countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. The Americans, on the other hand, enjoyed something of a balance of power between the two larger sides, the U.S., the West, and the Soviet Union, or the East. So you have hegemony promoting peace on the eastern side of Europe and balance of power promoting it between East and West. This balance would be maintained throughout the Cold War era and could be one of the principal reasons there was not a hot war between the two superpowers. But a lot changed since 1990. The dissolution of the Soviet Union, the unification of the two Germanys, and of course the liberation of all of Eastern Europe. This is the old Cold War boundary, and as you can see, left and right, East and West, they're roughly balanced. But since the Cold War ended, there are 2 noticeable trend lines. The first is that, obviously, the Soviet Union, since it's gone, is no longer the hegemon of Eastern Europe. And there's also a loss of the balance of power between the West and the East. And what that means from this map is that those 2 countries in particular, Belarus to the north, Ukraine to the south, are absolutely central to Russian strategic and security interest. If they turn blue, that sounds the alarm bells in Moscow. So if NATO encourages Ukraine, there's an increased likelihood that the Russians would invade. And should the old leadership, this pro-Moscow, somehow be replaced in Belarus, there's a very real likelihood the Russians will go there also, because Russia struggles to be secure without controlling those two large land masses. In 2022, of course, the Russians did invade Ukraine, and the reasons and explanations for that vary greatly among analysts. Some will argue this is all about Vladimir Putin, his psyche, the delusions of greatness, the desire to reestablish the Soviet Union, to reverse what he called the tragedy of the Cold War's end and the disillusion of the Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Others will argue it was simply a miscalculation. He believed he could easily conquer Ukraine, that his forces were sufficient, and so he struck while the opportunity presented itself. And the third school is that Russia's hand was largely forced because of NATO enlargement throughout the 1990s and 2000s.
The move of NATO into Central and Eastern Europe, right up to the borders of Russia, right into Russia's front porch, was a historic mistake. And if we are in a second Cold War, that's what started it.
I think it's important to remember that there was a verbal promise made by George H.W. Bush, Secretary of State Baker, to Gorbachev after the fall of the wall that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward.
I worked on Russia between 1990 and 95 at the White House as an advisor to both President George H.W. Bush and President Clinton. I was ambassador to NATO. We never made a commitment that we would not expand NATO into Eastern Europe. We made a commitment that we would not station nuclear weapons on the territory of the former Warsaw Pact states, and we have kept that commitment.
To say that we should freeze NATO enlargement would be another way to reward Putin, to legitimize his policies. You're basically admitting there will be a line of division. You will have countries who are not allowed to pursue their national interests because of a Russian dominion.
Whatever the reason, the Russians invaded. Their advances stalled very quickly. They had anticipated reaching Kiev within a handful of days, a week at the max, and then taking all the rest of Ukraine once the leadership of that country was out of the picture. But it didn't work out that way. The Russians invaded. They were halted by the stiff Ukrainian defenses. Western assistance began to arrive in military armaments, and we've seen roughly a 3-year stalemate since that initial invasion. NATO countries, of course, surround Ukraine, and it should be noted that they were not invaded. So one could argue that, well, if Ukraine had been admitted earlier, maybe Ukraine would not have been invaded either. Let's look at the options here for NATO in Ukraine and how this war may unfold over time. At the two ends of the spectrum of outcomes, we find the Russian victory, and on the other end, a Ukrainian victory. All other scenarios are found in between. I can say with a high degree of confidence, as I've said for 3 years, it's highly unlikely that Russia will be victorious. Its war aim was to topple the government in Kiev and conquer the territory of Ukraine. I don't think it has the military capacity to do so. Having said that, no illusions here, Ukraine's not going to win this war either. It's very unlikely at this point that it will liberate the Donetsk region in the east or Crimea from Russian grasp anytime soon. And so what that means is that we have something in between the two. It could lean towards a Russian victory, but not getting all the way there, and the Ukrainians may counter that by having more success on the battlefield without fully liberating their country. And this is where NATO will play a role, because the policies that we adopt moving forward may determine whether the dial turns more towards Russia's side or more towards Ukraine's. Options include the status quo, providing Ukraine just enough armaments to stay alive, to keep the tide from moving in the Russian direction, holding off any Russian expansion, but not enough for it to liberate the East and Crimea. We could upgrade that and say containment isn't just about the members of NATO, but allies of NATO as well, including Ukraine, providing them with stronger support. or more aggressively, we could provide the Ukrainian military with internal strike capacity, long-range missiles to reach deep into Russia, to disrupt supply chains, communication centers, or possibly even attack significant assets in and around Moscow. With each of these policy decisions comes a price tag, but also a set of risks. Status quo has by far the lowest risk. We've been supporting Ukraine now for 3 years, and we haven't seen a direct war between the U.S. and Russia, or any NATO member, I should say. Containment Plus has a higher level of risk, and of course providing Ukraine with the ability to strike deep inside of Russia may lead to Russia attacking neighboring countries like Poland, and that could lead to a catastrophic war between NATO forces and the Russians. Donald Trump, elected in 2024, second term in office. Is this a game changer for NATO and Ukraine? He's pledged to end the war immediately. Not exactly sure how he's going to do that. He's indicated an end to U.S. military aid to Ukraine. And that, of course, would be a significant development because Russia's a lot stronger, larger, more powerful than Ukraine. Ukraine is holding back the tide of war through NATO assistance. We're effectively balancing power in Eastern Europe. And the U.S., no doubt, if it stops providing military assistance, creates a big hole in NATO's support of Ukraine. The question is, will the Europeans fill that hole? And if they do, it's likely to come from France and Germany, the United Kingdom, and even outsiders, non-NATO members, such as South Korea. That, of course, remains to be seen. I do thank you, as always, for joining me today and encourage you to stay engaged and make great decisions.